Professor Sabya Mishra, who's joining us who has traveled all the way from Memphis to be here. Sabya his expertise is in travel demand modeling, statistical analysis, econometric modeling, with application to multimodal systems. His primary work has been in transit, but I've seen his papers being applied to several other systems. And today he's going to talk about autonomous vehicles in freight. So,
thank you. Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Avi. Good afternoon, everyone. And today we'll be talking about adoption of autonomous vehicles in freight. So we essentially know that there are a lot of number of disruptive technologies. Those are being introduced in transportation. So one of the things that we're trying to do is understanding who is using them, or whether anybody is using them, or how these type of technologies are being diffused in our system. So what are some of the methods, what has been done in other disciplines? So today would be something that we'll be looking into an application in freight. So see, we're having just a little.
Let's try. You want to give it a try now?
Yeah.
There we go.
Okay. This one, right?
Yeah.
The top?
Yeah.
Okay.
It's all one button.
Okay.
So, yeah.
Okay, great.
There you go.
Yes. So great. So how essentially new technology diffuses is something that we're looking into. So whenever a new technology is introduced, then the decision maker thinks that whether should I go ahead and adopt it, or should I not adopt it, or should I think about adopting it later? So those are primarily three options that come into play. So if we look into the history of adoption research, there was a professor in Iowa State who came from Harvard and joined Iowa State and looked into the diffusion process by looking into hybrid corn in Iowa. So people were growing traditional corn, and hybrid corn was slowly being introduced into the system. So he wanted to know who and why they're using hybrid corn. Who are the farmers, why they're using hybrid corns. So over the many number of years of research, what he came about, it's something what we see on the right-hand side in a graph. So as time passes by, on the x-axis, what we see is that who adopts the technology, and the y-axis is the percentage of penetration of that technology. So what we see initially is that it takes time for some people or a majority of people to adopt right away. But what we see is that there are some people who are called as innovators. They're just waiting for that innovation to come out, and they're ready to adopt. Very similar to a lot of people been waiting for a new version of Apple or Samsung to be released, and they grab it on the very first day, or even pre-order. So they are about 2 to 3% of the population. Then there are a lot of people who debate on this. Is that, should we buy this? These are the pros and cons. They essentially wait for the innovators to adopt first, and then there are opinion leaders are going to adopt the next. Once any adoption reaches about 16% or so, then it just skyrockets. The growth is extremely high after that. From 16 till about 85%. The growth is very high. And what we see here is that the diffusion curve looks like something is an S-shaped curve. There are a lot of people, not a lot, but at least some people who are they're always like, this innovation is not good. We are completely against it. They will wait till about 85th% or so of the market to be saturated. Then they will decide, maybe the system is as such, they're forcefully adopting that type of innovation, such as, for example, a smartphone or internet. People even who liked to use paper-based system, they use internet, or Microsoft Office, for example. So those are 5 different types of population segment that Rogers defined that happens in adoption. Then his research was been significantly implemented in many disciplines. More than 10,000 or so papers have written in various disciplines. So that's how he defined adoption. So we thought that before we look into various different types of adoptions, let's before we go into freight sector, let's look into what has happened over the years. So this is a graph that we have on the x-axis years since product product is introduced to the market, and the y-axis is the market penetration. So what we see is that let us see two examples. For example, VCR and digital camera. So VCRs and digital cameras never reached 100% market penetration because things like smartphones came on the way. Everybody was not fascinated about digital camera. People never used, everybody did not use digital camera. They used other form of devices essentially to take pictures. That is why that never reached 100% of market penetration. Same as VCR, like online streaming and everything else came into play. VCR came into about 80% of penetration, but never reached 100% of penetration. But there are things such as television. Everybody uses television that reached 100% penetration. Cell phones, almost everybody uses, if not 100%, but close to 100%. So there are examples of successful penetration, market penetration of technologies, and there are examples of not so successful. So this is just to showcase that typically many adoptions followed like a type of a S-curve as kind of in their behavior. So why are we looking into adoption research is that in terms of vehicular technology, what we see is that the way we have been driving is kind of portrayed to be changed. People in 1910 and 20s were not using automobiles. So there are pictures in Manhattan, 1910, there were not a single car. Everybody was riding like in horses. But you go in 1920, within 10 years of time, not a single horse car to be seen. So in 10 years, everything was changed, being a type of a disruptive technology. We're not saying that may happen right now with autonomous vehicles, that all of our traditional vehicles will be replaced by either partial automation or full automation. But we see there is a potential because there are a lot of advantages of automation technology. That is how it's being introduced. There are more than 100 companies, and all companies being multi-billion-dollar industries are looking into this. So we may not see a full automation being adopted right away, but we do see that partial automation is being adopted. So what we see is that there are some research that people have done looking into autonomous vehicle adoption. So what are the primary approaches people have looked into? Mostly based on sales forecasts. How much people who have bought this, and based on who have bought this and when they have bought this, based on sales market, people have tried to forecast how this penetration is going to go. And people have looked into various types of choice models as well. But the first three, for example, the sales forecast or looking into previous technology type of adoption, as well as choice models, they do suffer from one of the characteristics of innovations is that communication. They do not interact peer-to-peer communication. Peer-to-peer communication has a significant impact in which people behave in adopting or not adopting a technology. For example, someone before buying it needs to be convinced that this technology is worthwhile looking at. And that only happens if one talks to a friend or talks to a peer or being influenced by media or being influenced by a social network. So those things are kind of not present right now, as of now, not present. So the thing to look for is what Rogers initially began, is that communication channel is one of the important factors in looking into adoption of innovations. So we looked into two different approaches that we have. One we call as an aggregate level, there is something in disaggregate level. Let's not talk much detail into it right now, but we will look into it just in a few minutes. So why autonomous trucks? We're looking into autonomous trucks. Why? That's one of the areas that not many people are looking at it right now, but it has potential. So what we see is that about 4.2% of our total fleet in the US are trucks. So that's about 66.4 million vehicles we're looking into. And they cover about 10% of the annual VMT, vehicle miles of travel. So if we look into the vehicle miles traveled of individual vehicles versus a truck covers, close to more than 6 times of VMT than a personalized vehicle. So we focus on adoption of autonomous trucks here, just to look into the disruptive nature of the AV technology that we have, and the crucial roles that the trucks play in our transportation system. Are we looking into just the conventional trucks or some sort of automation that we will have in trucks? So that is what we're looking into. Not only from the side of the shipper who is going to ship the products using a truck, but also from the side of a planner perspective. For example, a person in DOT would like to know what are the type of vehicles that various shippers are going to use. Then will they need some sort of roadside assistant units, or do they need some sort of smart infrastructure to accommodate those? So for public agencies to get an understanding of how many autonomous trucks are available in the market, they need to have some sort of a prediction model that gives us some sense of the market penetration. So that's essentially the rationale of why we're looking into this research. But before we look into adoption research, we wanted to see what happens in adoption. So we talked about peer-to-peer communication. Let us look into the left-hand side graph here. The left-hand side graph is a social network between different individuals. So there are 3 individuals in the left-hand side graph. One is an adopted agent represented in blue, and there is a potential adopter who is represented in green, and there are some susceptible agents in the system. That means they're not fully convinced that this type of technology is ever going to penetrate. What we see that there is a social network, meaning communication that happens between different agents. But what is important to understand here is that what is the strength of their connection? What is the strength of their relationship? So we see that, for example, there is a strong sense of correlation between 2 susceptible agents. You see on the left, there's a thickness. That thickness represents that these 2 peers are very well connected. Similarly, we see that, for example, an adopted agent versus a susceptible agent, they're not so well connected because their strength is not a stronger tie. So once we establish this communication channel of individuals, then we can tell who is going to adopt, who is not going to adopt based on their behavior. So that's essentially personalized or individual adoption, how we explained. We did some work earlier this year that is based on individual adoption. But what we see in organizational adoption is that companies, firms, or organizations that do not behave exactly the same way as individuals do. For example, a company is more likely to take a risk if they anticipate larger benefits in the future for them. So similarly, they would like to see who are their competitors. Individuals may or may not see in that viewpoint. So, and also there are firms of different characteristics. Firms or companies such as large size, medium size, or a small size, they have their unique characteristics. And there lies some sort of a communication channel between them. And how that communication channel is, we will look into it. Sometimes smaller companies operate in a very smaller geographic area. Larger companies operate nationwide. Regional companies operate something like a statewide level. So how those are, we will look into their characteristics. So what we see here is that individual versus organizational adoption is that competition essentially play a role as we talked. Whether marketing will have some sort of strategy, marketing has a lot of influences in individual adoption. That is something that has been previously published in many different type of adoptions, for example, smartphones. But will that have a significant impact in organizational adoption or not? We need to see. And the size and organizational structure, meaning how big is the firm and how are the structure? Is it a hierarchical based structure within the company? Or, for example, if we look into FedEx as a company, FedEx is one large company, but there are 17 different companies within FedEx. FedEx Freight, FedEx Ground, FedEx Air, FedEx Kinko's. All these are separate units within the same company. So we need to understand the organizational structure of a company before we understand how they're going to adapt. And the pair of decisions or few things that we want is when are they going to adapt? And if they're deciding to adapt, how many units are they going to adopt? Those are the two things we're looking for. So here we looked into organizational theory, a specific theory that exists in business research is that how organizations behave. So organizational theory says into three things that depicts the behavior of an organization. So the first one is their managerial character, meaning how the entrepreneurs are structured within the company. Then what are some of the attributes of the organization? And then the business environment in which they operate. The first one is the entrepreneurial character. If we look into small and medium-sized firms versus large firms, in small and medium-sized firms, we see that mostly their decisions are centralized, meaning thereby think of a small firm, like a small business. They have one person or maybe 5 people working in the company. One person is the boss, and the boss is essentially making the decision. And not necessarily a lot of employees have significant impact in the final decision being taken. But that's not necessarily the case in terms of large firms. They're more decentralized. As long as a specific unit of a big firm is giving profit, then the firm is happy. So they're decentralized. Gender plays a role in terms of who is making the decision, meaning we are defining whether they're risk averse or risk seeker. So meaning they're willing to take the risk or they're more like playing safe. So what is that nature? Whether the decision-making entity is younger or a little bit older, because that is also have some impact. Education level and experience, as well as a professional network. So these are the attributes, or these are the characteristics of small and medium-sized firms. But in large firms, mostly they are decentralized. The individual smaller things that has a lot of impact on small firms does not necessarily have impact in larger firms. Let us see what are the organizational attributes that we need to look into. In terms of organizational attributes, we need to look into age. In smaller firms, negatively correlates with spirit of the smaller firms, meaning thereby, if the smaller firm is not making more benefit, but the chief is thinking that if we embark on this in this innovation, then that may generate loss to the company if it is not successful. Resources, wealthier firms are more likely to adopt if they have more money rather than someone who is making a little bit of profit. Scarcity of budget is something that prohibits or decelerates the process of adoption. What type of search strategies that they look for, meaning thereby a company is whether as a startup company or they are more open to adopt versus someone who is a old or traditional type of company, whether they're willing to adopt or not. So those are some of the characteristics that we looked into. But in larger firms, not necessarily the things that are important to small firms will work for large firms. For large firms, the most important thing is the managerial ratio. How many managers are there compared to the number of employees? Because they are the ones who are going to make the decision. That is not necessarily true in small firms. Complexity of business, as we were discussing, that many firms have many sub-centers or separate type of business units. They're very complex in nature. And interconnectedness, that means how the information flows within a company, that also has some impact. In terms of business environment, we look into firm performance, whether do they have one unit or multiple units, number of competitors that they have. Smaller companies might not have many competitors, whereas larger number of companies may have small competitors, meaning, for example, if we look into the market of ride sharing, there are not many companies who do ride share. There are only 2-3 companies. If we look into couriers in freight, there are not many companies who essentially carry the product and deliver. It's a small number of companies that we look into. And similarly, there are a lot of other features that we came up with that specifically describes how a company is structured and what is their willingness to adopt or not. So we first now look into two different methods that we saw. The first one is aggregate method that was done by a researcher called as Bass, and the model is named after him, called as a Bass adoption model. This is an aggregate type of diffusion of innovations type of model. So Bass says that there are two factors which impacts innovation. One is called as coefficient of innovation, another one is called as coefficient of imitation. And everything plays around these two factors. So CON, which is the coefficient of innovation, is essentially internal factors. That means what happens within the company. COM is not internal, it's external. What happens in the competitors or things which people or companies who are doing similar type of business, what do they do? So combining the internal structure or the internal environment and the external environment, Bass model says that we'll be able to capture what is the percentage of innovations that is likely to be adopted by individuals or companies. That's how Bass essentially tells that it is possible. And there are ways to simplify or further extend the Bass model into other things, such as we can capture the effect of price, various types of marketing strategies to tell how the diffusion is going to go. So I would not like to go in detail here, but it's a very simplistic formula of what Bass uses. What it uses is a factor. The first one is P. NT on the left-hand side is the total number of adopters at a specific time. We're looking at a time frame, such as something like 20 to 30 years or 20 to 40 years, depending on whatever is our time frame. And for each year, we want to estimate how many number of potential adopters are going to be, because the next year's number of adopters is going to be a function of how many people adopted in the previous year. That is why we have a time component over there. So once we have the information about CON and COM, then we need to identify how many number of cumulative number of users are there. That is capital NT there. So we know P, which is CON, Q, which is COM, and capital NT is the cumulative number of users that we have. Then the last one is the X of T, which is the external influencer variables. Typically, people use very simplistic regression models to get various types of X's in there. It could be the income, it could be the firm size, it could be the number of employees or the number of vehicles do they have. So they get the value of X of T, which is at the bottom of this. So it's a very simplistic formulation that Bass uses. So this is something we talked. I can skip this slide. Is that this slide represents the type of operations small, medium, and large companies do based on their geographies. So what we did is we wanted to apply a simplistic Bass model to begin with in a case study area. So we chose where our university is located in the city of Memphis that belongs to Shelby County in Tennessee. So we collected the firm data. What you see on the right-hand side is what is the fleet size per square mile. That means companies are owning number of trucks, be them to be commercial vehicles or short distance single unit trucks or short distance multi-unit trucks or long distance large trucks. So what type of trucks are they owning? We got that information. So once we have that, we have about a little over than 1,500 companies who operate in that area, being one of the major freight hubs of the country. So we identified by using some sort of a clustering approach to segregate them into small size, medium size, and large size firms. Our next goal was to find what are the CON and COM values, taking different attributes into consideration. So we did that. So there are different CON and COM values. Based on their values, they're going to predict how many, essentially what we see in terms of results is that we see on the top graph here on the right-hand side is the number of organizations adopting. Out of those 1,500 odd organizations, we see that not more than 400 or so are willing to adopt. And on the bottom graph, what we see is that what is the fleet? Number of vehicles are transformed from the conventional trucks to automated trucks. We see that on the bottom of the graph. So those are the two important things a planning agency would like to see. How many organizations is a secondary product, but how many trucks are converting the traditional trucks to automated trucks? That is something we wanted to see. And after that, we saw that is BAS model good enough to be done some scenario analysis. So we framed 6 different scenarios, but I would like to highlight only 2 of them here. So scenario 5, we see that, okay, automated trucks provide significant benefits and they're justified to be on the market. They're benefiting, it is okay to replace them. That means we're looking for both CON and COM to be positive. That is scenario 5. We see scenario 2 is that they're not economically justified. For example, the cost that a company is paying to purchase the truck, it is not essentially providing the same amount of benefits that was anticipated in terms of life, in terms of savings in crash, in terms of fuel consumption. It could be many things. In those cases, COM and CON will be lower. So those are 2 extreme ends of these 6 scenarios, and there are a few scenarios we developed in between. We looked into other type of innovations as well. We see that whether the model provides us some results that is intuitive or not. We do see that scenario 5 is essentially what is giving us the most adoption, and scenario 2 being the lowest. But what we see is that in firm adoption, CON has the larger impact compared to COM. That means within the organization, belief has a larger impact compared to what their peers are thinking. So that is something that we found out. But we see that BAS model is very limited in terms of its own application, because this is an aggregate model. If we ask them that what are the behaviors, how do we implement individuals' firm behavior, that is very difficult. And COM and CON are only parameters, not necessarily having a lot of behavioral interpretation. That is why it is very limited. And there are challenges in validating the model. That means if someone says that, can you show me how good is your model? There is no answer to that in terms of BAS model. So that led us to look into other type of models which are disaggregate in nature. So in terms of disaggregated natures, we have choice models to look into, because each individual unit will have a utility, and then that utility expresses what is the attractiveness of a particular innovation. But we do see that choice models work good if the individual who is responding to a specific question has seen what is the impact of that. But AV technology is as such that it is not on the market. It's not necessarily similar to, are you willing to pay $4 of toll if I make this bridge as a paid bridge? Then people see what is the time that is taking to go from point A to point B. They can answer that because they're familiar with that. But here in this case, there is not a possibility. A specific stated preference survey is not going to work in this approach. So, and as well, choice models are not specifically suited for this communication channel to be established. Peer-to-peer effect channels are very difficult to embed in choice models. So we thought that maybe agent-based models would be a good approach. So we went through agent-based simulation approach, because we can capture firm behavior and market environment much more easily. Of course, simulation is not the way to go throughout in next 50 to 100 years, but it is a good starting point to see what would be the effect. And then by then, if we have choice models well suited, then we can think of establishing peer-to-peer connection in choice models and understand what is happening. So the goal of the agent-based model is to have a type of a simulated environment in which we anticipate the real world is going to behave. So that's the goal. So in terms of methodology, the first one we need is an organizational survey. That means we want to understand what people are thinking or what firms are thinking, because other than that, we'll not be able to do anything. The second step is that in ABMs, we need to synthesize the population. For example, in a city, there are 100 companies. All 100 companies would not be responding to the survey. But our goal is to predict how many trucks will all 100 companies will adopt in a specific year. So we need to have information about them. So population synthesis is a process where we expand the sample to a population, synthesizing the data using marginal values. So that is a second step we need. The third step is we need to synthesize the network. Once we have individual information, we need to create that social network of all companies that we have in the data. So that is network synthesis. And then in the last step, we need to identify what is the adoption of diffusion that is going to have. So in next 15 minutes or so, we will look into detail into each of these steps here. Is what is the adoption criteria? How do we establish the communication channel? How do we impact how do we insert some regulations that may come into play? So that's essentially is the framework. So very easy to first look into the survey. Survey is the foundational step of this analysis, is that we need to understand what others are thinking. So two different surveys are needed for this, one for small and medium size and one for large size companies, because we looked into from organizational theory how each of the companies vary. So one survey for everybody is not going to do it. So we have to capture that behavior. That means we have to design the survey accordingly by capturing those. So that's how we design the survey. Mostly taking into organizational attributes, business and environment, as well as entrepreneurial characteristics. Those three things are needed. So that is the first step. The second step is population synthesis. I just explained that how do we collect the data. Even in survey, our survey data needs to be targeted, meaning thereby not to individual firms, but by X% of data belonging to a specific category. We need that. So that is what we get. And in population synthesis, the data that we collect from the survey serves as the seed. And our goal, our target is our marginal. So if you're familiar with population synthesis, it's a straightforward process of how to expand a sample to a population. So as the output, what we have is all synthetic firms, synthetically generated, because we did not get data from each and every individual firm, but they have all the attributes that we wanted. So a process that gives us that information is called as iterative proportional updating. There are iterative proportional factoring methods are also available, called as IPF or IPU approaches. So those can be used to obtain the synthetic data. And then what we do is that we from the data itself, we see that is there any connection between adoptedness, because there are questions those are being asked to the companies to respond whether they would like to adopt or not. And they have given us some response. So we'd like to see if that relationship exists or not. Then the next one is our network synthesis. So we need to synthesize the network. That means we have individual companies located in specific geographic locations in a city, and then we need to identify where they are and how they do their businesses. So we design the synthetic network based on the principle of homophily. So homophily is that a possibility that a pair of agents are going to establish some sort of connection based on their proximity or based on some other type of characteristics that we need to define. Once we do that, then we can establish the communication between all networks. So how we essentially establish that network, that connection is based on the Euclidean distance. Once we have the network, we can compute the Euclidean distance. That could be 5 dimensions, 8 dimensions, it depends. So whatever goes into the calculation of Euclidean distance, it could be age, gender, managerial ratio, you name it, all the variables that we looked into. So once we have the Euclidean distance, so that represents the relationship or tie between the companies in the network. So that is something that we do. So for example, we see a synthetic network of a data that we generated in Memphis. So what we see on the right-hand side of this figure is that there are a lot of companies which are strongly tied with each other. That means they're clustered and their decision-making is somehow peer-to-peer connected. However, on the left-hand side, we do not see that of a strong correlationship. That means they do businesses on their own. Probably they are not that strongly influenced by their peers. And on the left-hand side, on the top, we see that there are some companies which are not at all strongly correlated with others. They do their business in their own. So more distance represents weaker relationship. Smaller distances represent their stronger relationship. So right now what we have in the synthetic network, each node representing a firm and the tie, that is the distance, representing the strength of communication between them. So we have each company in our network and their communication pattern. Now we can evolve this network over time. That how this network evolves over time. Who is the agent who is adopting, who is the agent not adopting, or who is the agent who is deferring to a later time. So that's how we unfold the diffusion of innovation process here. So now next we look into communication channel. Once we establish the network, what we see that there are various types of communication channels. It could be just peer-to-peer communication. It could be the impact of price. It could be the impact of advertisement. It could be the impact of marketing strategy. It could be of anything. What we see is that at personal level, the information that is received from peers is about 2 to 7 times more stronger than what people receive from advertisement. For example, at individual level, if a friend or a family member tells that I have purchased this and it is working great, that has much more impact compared to when one sees the advertisement. That may not be the case for every individual, but on an average, that is what literature suggests that that's how it's going to be. And then essentially we're going to learn this process over time. That means the network is going to evolve over a learning process. So and then communication. Communication channel that establishes is a very simple formula here, is that what is the utility of that agent at time t-1 and a chunk or another term essentially that represents type of a communication channel. I see that I have 9 more minutes. I have a few more slides to cover, so I'll just pace my presentation a little bit more. But what you see here is that we have 2 factors. One is called as a learning factor, and another one is called as a word of mouth. So word of mouth has a lot of impact. That means everybody telling either positively or negatively, either on a telephone or a text or in social media. That's how word of mouth spreads. Word of mouth has been a bigger impact in other innovations. So we wanted to capture in the second term, what is the word of mouth? Essentially, the Z term is a dummy variable if one is communication happens or not. And then beta is essentially a parameter that has behavioral interpretation now. We did not see that. Beta positive meaning stronger correlation. Negative means negative correlation. Now, each individual betas also can be compared with each other. That means which factor is contributing more, which factor is contributing less. We can identify. That was not the case before, but now in ABMs we see that. Regulation. Government puts regulation, or individual states have regulations for vehicles, or there are different types of advertisement strategies those exist. How that will have impact. Very similar to communication, we have another term, but this term has another effect called as a dissipation rate here, rho, which is in the denominator. So that means it has a negative impact towards the utility of regulation. So that's how we capture regulation in the utility of agents. And the decision to adopt or not to adopt can be deterministic or stochastic in nature. There are a range of options, but one thing is that the simplest rule is that if one agent adopts, probably the neighborhood agents or the agent which is next to it, most likely it's going to adopt if the strength of communication is much larger, like a virus infection. That's how the network spreads. But we looked into three criteria for adoption. One can be based on utility, other could be network or innovativeness. Each of these three can be considered in its isolation, or they can be combined depending on the nature. So the utility principle is that agents are they make their decision based on utility theory, meaning the attractiveness. That means firms are what we call as utilitarian. So how do we decide that? We can convert the utilities to probability values, or we can have a cutoff utility. So we can go either of the approaches in terms of adoption criteria. And then whether the agent is going to adopt or not can be based on if the utility is more than the cutoff value or not. Or if it is probability, if the higher the probability of different alternatives those are given, then that firm is going to adopt. So that is based on criteria 1. The second and third criteria are the network it can be based on competition. That can be a probabilistic event again. And the third one is the innovativeness, which would be in their peer-to-peer communication. So based on those three criteria, the decision to adopt different weights can be given to utility, network, and innovativeness, or just one of them can be taken if that is the case. So how simulation happens? It's a very simplified simulation in terms of we initialize the model. That means we take a company and we have information about their fleet size in terms of their vehicle age, mileages, and everything. And then once we have that, we take it to the next time period. That means our time period has not ended. And then we update the vehicle age and mileage, and we also update the expected utilities and innovativeness from the synthetic network that we have and the adoption criteria. Based on that, we have information about what happens in time t+1, and we iterate this till we hit our number of time periods. So that's essentially a very simplistic way of simulation. So the next slide is essentially explaining that figure, what we covered in terms of what happens in initialization and communication submodel. So what we are talking here is that if a vehicle has reached age or mileage and a new vehicle is available that has autonomous features, most likely that is a very simple rule for the company to make versus actually a new or newer vehicle to replace. So that can be easily integrated as well. So some preliminary results that we want to look at. On the left-hand side, what we see is that what is the effect of price? So the price of a regular truck ranges somewhere about 130,000 to 200,000, versus companies are predicting that cabs are going to be, or the fully automated vehicles are going to be definitely higher. But how much high is something that is not fixed, but somewhere about 50% higher the cost is going to be. So market price is a big determinant. So we wanted to see if the market price is we are able to capture it, and the model is providing us reasonable answers or not. So we took that, okay, the market price is going to reduce by 5%. Probably the innovation in next 25 years will be still 10% maximum. But if the price is going to reduce by at least 20% or so, then the companies are much more willing to adopt, or because they operate in a scarce budget situation as well. So this is a price variation graph. And the second one is that marketing effect. What we see that we read from literature that companies are not much more influenced by marketing strategies because they know their own strategies. They do not need to be biased by others because their business pattern is very well known to them. So we see that, okay, marketing strategies are okay, but as long as we go beyond the very mild type of marketing strategies, whether intense marketing or fairly intense marketing is not going to make any difference in terms of the firm's decision. That's going to remain the same. What we see is that the impact of networking, if the significant networking happens between companies, some companies do merge with each other in their decision-making process or so forth. We see that adoption is going to grow, but not necessarily making the adoption to 100% or so. Impact of negative word of mouth. Negative word of mouth has been a significant impact in other innovations. That if people spread negative words about the innovation, then definitely it has negative impact. What we see that if negative word of mouth and number of dissatisfied agents, if they will remain, definitely that will have an extremely negative impact. And then that is going to, essentially decelerate the innovation process. So that's what we looked into in terms of users or automated trucks. But this approach not necessarily can be applied to autonomous trucks. It can be applied to many different applications, such as companies looking into truck platooning as a technology. They do not need to replace their vehicle, but they can use different technologies to make sure that their truck can platoon with other vehicles. Or companies are about automated transit, automated bus systems, or drone applications, 3D printing. DOT is thinking about roadside units or DSRC type of equipments. Those are potential applications as well. Not necessarily exactly the same model can be applied, but similar structure. In terms of discussion, ABMs have much more behavioral impact compared to simple BAS models, and very easy. We can change the simulation over time. If we see that newer things, firms behave in different ways or some characteristics become distinct, we can implement that. In terms of limitations, acquiring organizational data is a challenge. Companies do not want to reveal their business strategy. They're not going to do that. So the survey needs to be specifically designed in a manner that we get adequate information. And similarly, the thing is, people ask about validation. In validation, what happens is that ABMs are easy to validate. That means we can always go with the holdout sample approach. That means we can collect, for example, 100 samples. We can keep 20 samples and not use them. So we develop our model using 80 samples. And once the model is developed, we apply them to our 20 that is left over. So we can use always holdout sample. Or we can use backcasting as well, meaning once the innovation is spread out, we can backcast the models to see how well we did or what changes we need to do. In terms of current efforts, we are working on essentially the full survey that we need to implement. That is one of the current efforts. I'd like to acknowledge this work that I presented was funded through a USDOT Tier 1 center located at Florida Atlantic University. I'd like to acknowledge some of my co-PIs here. Dr. Miguel Figliosi, he will be involved in our phase 2 work, which we will start very sooner, as well as we have a postdoctoral associate, as well as a student who is working on this project. We have published some of our work. The first one is a journal article. The other 2 are conferences. So if you're coming to the TRB annual meeting, then you will see 2 presentations on this topic. And we're working on a few other things, essentially improving the ABM approach, that how we can improve it further. So I'm 2 minutes over, but I would like to thank you all, and we'll be happy to take any questions.
If I could just have you get into the
with the connected autonomous truck, would there still be a person on board to navigate the city streets when they arrive at their destination?
Yeah, that's a good question. So that is a topic that is still under discussion. Definitely a driver would be needed because there will be things that those are not fully automated. For example, picking up the product or keeping it at a specific place within the truck. For long distance travel, probably the driver just need to be there in idle in a fully automated truck. But in the last mile deliveries, definitely there could be individuals needed, or if there are robots in there. Dr. Figliosi's work on last mile. Both Dr. Unikrishnan and Dr. Figliosi are working in that type of where probably a driver would be needed or not at the very last mile delivery. Maybe if the driver is there, probably can do the loading and unloading at the first mile and last mile. But for long distance, if the truck is intended to work on its own, then probably the driver can be there, but can do other things instead of driving. Yeah, we have a question here.
Yeah, you mentioned that one of the limiting challenges was to get survey responses from companies, especially trucking companies, which are a little bit hard to deal with usually. What was your best strategy to get the freight companies to answer your surveys or to get responses from them? Yeah, so well, the questions need to be, first of all, not targeted to reveal their business practices, number one. Number two is not to ask any personalized information. So the first thing is that needs to be told that that whatever information they share, it's going to be confidential, and we do not ask even the company's name or anything like that per se. So in that way, they feel a little bit more comfortable in giving the answers. So we find that even in individual surveys, because the questions are so deeply involved. For the individual survey, we did a survey on campus as well as in the state of Tennessee.
Even in the individual survey, we were told that your questions are as such, you are just intruding in one's private life, the type of questions that we were asking. So we had to, we needed that response. Otherwise, the model is not going to be good. We wanted to capture that rational behavior of individuals. But a lot of interactions with people who do survey research versus what we want to do, a lot of feedback goes and before the final survey is designed. For example, in the survey, we wrote, what is the likelihood that you're willing to adopt an autonomous vehicle? They said that nobody understands in the outer world what is an autonomous vehicles, right? As a self-driving car, they would understand much better if you do that. So things like that, we work on to improve the survey. Yeah, of course, the acceptance rate or the return of survey percentages really depend how good is your survey, how complicated, how lengthy, what you want to do. So there is always a balance.
Another question?
Yeah, here.
Yeah, and then if anyone wants to try them down for the next.
Of autonomous fleets.
Yeah. We ask actually, if you look into the presentation later, I would like to point to a specific section of our published paper called as barriers to innovation. So we ask how do we model, or we present in the paper how do we model barriers. So we asked about 17 questions or so related to barriers. For example, for autonomous vehicle adoption, individual level, we asked them the question that, are you fearful that your car would be attacked by virus? Meaning looking into the cybersecurity aspects of it. A lot of people represented yes. How about the vehicle loses Wi-Fi connection at certain places? Then what happens? So what are the critical barriers in autonomous vehicle adoption? I think about 17 different factors we came up with. But yes, lot of, I go to the example of the Uber vehicle crash in Phoenix, sometimes how in the same day, more than 100, individual fatalities happen in the country, but the focus has been on the autonomous vehicle, justifiably so. Why somebody would like to give up, that I'm the decision maker of my vehicle, I would like technology to take over. That means that technology has to be soundproof. So whether, for example, braking systems, identifications of fixed objects versus moving objects, how they're going to do, this is something that is evolving. We do not have a fully automated vehicle that we see that it can penetrate through. That's why a lot of companies are still doing research in the area.
Another question?
Thank you. So this is obviously a complicated topic because obviously not many people are working on it. That means that it's not as easy or straightforward. So since the time you started till now, what are the things that maybe you learned or you were surprised that, before working on this, you didn't know, or, like over time, things that change your mind, or, So it's a very general question, but if you can just provide some.
Yeah, very, very good question. A lot of learning from the day we started. From the day we started, we did not have much idea about this. There is a theory called as diffusion of innovations, because we didn't find any literature in transportation about that. So we first looked into what BAS model works. We tried to come up with an example problem of how it works. Then slowly we looked into the ABM type of approaches. We looked into organizational theory. So we're looking into a lot of aspects that we had no idea about before. So that is a lot of learning. Then learning about how to incorporate individual behavior into the model is a challenge, because while in our publication, a lot of questions had come about validation, is that there are a lot of willingness to pay WTP type of models exist before. But the ABM framework diverges a little bit from the traditional WTP based approaches. So how it's going to work. So for example, some people asked us that for each individual, can you present the S-curve for each individual in your network? because they will follow some sort of a S-curve somewhere in the S-curve. So tell us who or where in the S-curve. Lot of learnings, and definitely the work what we have done so far, by no means it is kind of complete, or it is a good one, but it is a step towards understanding something that we have not looked into so far, because in our industry we never changed the way we drove before, or this is the time where the technology has the most impact in the history. That is why many disciplines are interested working in transportation, many different technologies. The Consumer Electronics Association, a CA conference, which is attended by more than 100,000 people, has a lot more now to offer in transportation than ever before. So how do we capture those type of things is a learning process almost on a daily basis. So these are just baby steps that we have taken so far. And probably this field is going to grow in the future.
In terms of adopting innovation in trucking, do the firms evaluate between the benefits of going all electric versus connected and autonomous?
Yes, that is a good question. So what we did not look into this work is the type of charging. We're looking into another aspect there. But the reason we did not look into that aspect is that we left that aspect to the manufacturer. So our assumption was that the manufacturer is going to design the vehicle in such a manner that it is not going to be detrimental to the decision of the vehicle owner. That means whether having an internal combustion based engine or having a battery operated vehicle, as long as the battery operated vehicle is not detrimental, it is not giving inconveniences in terms of comfort, in terms of convenience, in terms of cost, as long as it does not give any difficulties compared to internal combustion engines, then it's okay. So our assumption was that the vehicle manufacturer, is knowledgeable enough to release their vehicle with appropriate type of fueling system or battery system. But that is a good thing, because with that question, we're dealing right now to a much bigger problem to look at. If we look into vehicles with electric battery system, we need to look at the charging stations, where they are, whether it's going to be convenient or not convenient. But that is a good point that you brought, an excellent point, where a lot of research in transportation is going on right now. Is whether batteries are environmental friendly or not is a question that is still not a consensus. There's not a consensus among everybody what it's going to be, but because fuel is going to be used somewhere, if it is fossil fuel or it's even electricity, how electricity is generated, that question. But we did not essentially incorporate that, because our assumption is that manufacturer is knowledgeable enough.
I think we have time for one last question, if anybody has one. No? Okay, well, thank you for joining the Friday Transportation Seminar, and a big thank you to Professor Mishra.
Thank you.